Duluth Cutover, Minnesota, September 1892. The air, sharp with the scent of pine and the coming frost, carried the rhythmic scrape and thud of a shovel biting into rocky soil. On a small parcel of cleared land overlooking the raw, gray expanse of Lake Superior, Kārlis Ozoliņš was digging a hole. It was not a root cellar. It was not a well. It was, to the bewilderment of his neighbors, the foundation for a 20-foot log cabin. And it was enormous. By the second week, the trench was 4 feet deep and 30 feet long. Men walking the track to the logging camp would stop, lean on their axes, and watch the quiet Latvian work. He was not a large man, but his movements were economical, born of a lifetime of working with stone and earth. Silas Croft, whose own cabin sat on 4 stacked cornerstones not much bigger than pumpkins, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "What in God's name is he building, a fortress for the King of Sweden?" he asked Jedediah Miller. Miller, a man who had built 3 cabins in his life and considered himself an expert, shook his head. "It's madness, wasting the best building weeks digging to China. That hole will fill with water and freeze solid. It'll heave his cabin right into the sky come the thaw." The mockery was constant, a low hum of frontier certainty against which Kārlis worked in silence. He simply nodded when they offered their unsolicited, dire predictions. The hole grew deeper. 6 feet, then 7. He began undercutting the sides, hauling out bucket after bucket of dense, cold clay. Gilbert Thornburg, the St. Louis County land assessor, made a special trip out on his horse. He stood at the edge of the chasm, a ledger under his arm, his face a mask of official disapproval. "Ozoliņš," he called down, his voice echoing slightly in the pit. "The county record's a 20 by 20 residential claim. This looks more like the footings for a grain elevator. What is the purpose of this excavation?" From the bottom of the trench, covered in dirt, Kārlis looked up. "Pamati," he said, the Latvian word for foundation. "For the winter." Thornburg made a note in his ledger. "It's foolish," he said, not to Kārlis, but to the world at large. "The man's digging his own family's grave and calling it a home." The word spread through the settlement like a grass fire. The crazy Latvian. The man building his cabin on a tombstone. They laughed, but it was a nervous laughter, for the North Woods had a way of punishing foolishness with a brutal finality. What did this Latvian mason, this quiet immigrant from the Vidzeme region near Riga, understand about the deep, steady warmth of the earth that a generation of experienced American frontiersmen had missed? What secret was buried in that colossal hole that they, in their confidence, could not see? If you stick with me, I promise you will learn a fundamental principle of thermal physics that can keep a home warm with almost no fuel, a principle modern engineering is only now rediscovering. We build stories like this every week, celebrating the quiet genius of forgotten innovators. If that sounds interesting to you, consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the like button. And let us know in the comments, what's the most clever, low-tech solution to a big problem you've ever seen? Kārlis Ozoliņš was not a logger. He was not a carpenter. And he was certainly not a frontiersman in the way his neighbors understood the term. He was a pamati akmens būvētājs, a foundation stone builder. His hands did not know the heft of a felling axe. They knew the specific gravity of granite, the sharp fracture of schist, the patient layering of a dry stone wall that could settle for a century without losing its integrity. His father and his grandfather had built the foundations for the great stone barns of the Riga highlands, structures that had to withstand the frozen, heaving soils of a Baltic winter. They worked with kilns and lime mortar, with river stone and glacial till. This knowledge was as much a part of him as his language. He had brought his wife, Ilse, and their 2 children, 10-year-old Janice and 7-year-old Laga, to America for the promise of land. But their first winter in Minnesota had nearly broken them. They had spent it in a hastily erected shack provided by the land company, a standard frontier cabin with logs chinked with mud and moss, sitting on 4 shallow stone piers. It was a design that had worked in Ohio and Pennsylvania, but it was no match for the shores of Lake Superior. That winter, the cold was a physical entity, a predator that lived inside the walls with them. Kārlis remembered every failure with the clarity of a fresh wound. He remembered the sharp crack, like a rifle shot in the dead of night when their small cast-iron cook stove, shrinking in the intense cold while hot on the inside, split its firebox right along the seam, spilling hot coals onto the floor. Ilse had smothered it with sand, her face pale in the moonlight, the cabin's one source of heat now broken. He remembered his son, Janis, crying in frustration one morning because the leather laces on his boots, stiff with frozen moisture, had shattered into pieces when he tried to tie them. And he remembered the final indignity, going to the barn to light the lantern and finding the kerosene had turned to a thick, useless jelly, the flame refusing to draw up the wick. They survived, but barely. They burned wood at a terrifying rate, yet the cold was relentless. It came up through the floorboards, radiating a misery that no fire could defeat. Kārlis swore he would not face another winter like that. He was not a woodsman, but he knew the earth. And the earth, he knew, held a different answer. The conventional failure of the American log cabin in the far north was not a failure of the logs themselves. It was a failure of imagination, a failure to understand the ground on which they sat. The standard cabin was built to fight the air, but it completely ignored the earth. Settlers like Jedediah Miller placed their homes on shallow stone piers, just enough to level the first course of logs. This created a dead air space underneath, which they believed would insulate them. The problem wasn't the air. The problem was the ground itself. In St. Louis County, the frost line, the depth to which the soil freezes solid, was a full 6 feet. The ground beneath a conventional cabin became a solid, frozen block of earth at the same temperature as the air above it. When it was 40 below zero outside, it was 40 below zero just 2 inches beneath the floorboards. The floor of the cabin was, in essence, resting directly on a massive permanent ice block. Heat moves from hot to cold, always. The pitiful warmth generated by a wood stove inside the cabin was constantly being sucked down into this frozen mass. It was like trying to boil a pot of water while it sat on a glacier. You could burn cords of wood, you could make the stove glow red, but the floor would remain a source of perpetual, biting cold. Children couldn't play on it. Adults kept their boots on from dawn until dusk. Water spilled on it would freeze in minutes. Furthermore, these shallow foundations were unstable. The moisture in the soil would freeze and expand, creating powerful ice lenses that would heave the ground upwards. A cabin on piers would shift and twist, opening up new gaps in the chinking, breaking the seals around windows and doors, letting in more of the killing cold. Every spring, men had to re-level their cabins, a back-breaking, frustrating chore. They saw it as a necessary evil, a seasonal battle against nature. They accepted the frozen floors and the shifting walls as the price of living in the North. They treated the symptoms year after year, never recognizing the root cause of their misery. The problem wasn't the winter. The problem was their connection to it. Kārlis Ozoliņš began his innovation not with an axe, but with a shovel. For 3 weeks, he dug. The 8-foot-deep, 3-foot-wide trench was a testament to his singular vision. Neighbors stopped mocking and started watching with a kind of grudging awe at the sheer labor involved. He hit the water table at 7.5 feet, and for 2 days he bailed cold, clear water before the trench stabilized. He had breached the dominion of the frost. Next came the stone. For another month, he and young Janis worked with a stone boat, pulled by their lone ox, hauling hundreds of granite and basalt fieldstones from the edges of his property. He chose them with a mason's eye, seeking flat faces and predictable angles. He was not building a simple retaining wall. He was building a thermal conduit. He mixed his lime mortar in a shallow pit, a recipe of slaked lime, sand, and horsehair that he had learned as a boy. It was a slow-curing, flexible mortar, designed to accommodate the minute shifts of a massive stone structure. He began laying the first course of stone at the very bottom of the trench, 2 feet below the frost line, in the damp, stable earth that never froze. His method was meticulous. He laid a wide outer course and a wide inner course, fitting the stones together with minimal gaps. The center of the wall he filled with smaller rubble and a slurry of his lime mortar. He was not just building up. He was creating a solid, 3-foot-thick wall of immense thermal mass. As the wall rose past the frost line, his neighbor's skepticism returned. "He's burying a fortune in stone and mortar," Silas Croft declared to anyone who would listen. "Could have built a barn with what he's putting in that hole." The day Gilbert Thornburg returned for the official assessment was the day Kārlis began to lay the floor joists. The land assessor watched, his ledger open, as Kārlis did something no one had ever seen before. The massive, hand-hewn white pine joists did not simply rest on top of the foundation wall. Kārlis had constructed the top course of the foundation with a wide, flat, inner ledge. The joists were set into this ledge so that their tops were flush with the top of the stone wall. Then he laid a final course of wide, flat capstones that lapped over the ends of the joists, locking them into the foundation itself. The floor would not just sit upon the stone, it would be thermally and structurally bonded to it. Thornburg scribbled furiously. He did not understand the thermal principle, but he understood cost and materials. He saw an 8-foot-deep, 3-foot-thick mortared stone foundation for a cabin that would barely measure 20 by 20 feet. He saw days of labor and tons of material that, in his experience, were utterly unnecessary. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Ozoliņš," he said, his tone formal, "I am assessing this structure. Based on the depth, materials, and labor evident in this foundation, it far exceeds the standards for a residential homestead. It constitutes an over-improvement." He made another note. "I have no choice but to reclassify this parcel. Your tax rate will be assessed at the commercial industrial grade, equivalent to a mill or a smithy. You'll receive the notice. The new amount will be due in the spring." He said it with the cold finality of a man enforcing a rule he believed to be just. This wasn't just mockery. It was a punitive economic strike. The tax would be triple what Kārlis had planned for. It was a sum he could not possibly pay. Ilse had been watching from the edge of the clearing. She heard Thornburg's verdict, and her face went tight with worry. That evening, by the light of a tallow candle, she touched her husband's arm. "Kārlis," she said quietly in Latvian, "he will take the land." Was this wise? Kārlis looked at her, then at his children sleeping soundly. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the fire pit and a clean wood shingle. He did not argue or defend. He simply drew a picture. He drew the deep foundation, the frost line, and the warm earth below. Then he drew small arrows, moving from the deep earth up through the stone and into the floor of the house he had yet to build. He didn't have the English words to explain the physics, but he could draw its promise. He had not built a foolish thing, he had built a bridge. The secret Kārlis Ozoliņš understood was not in the logs, the windows, or the roof. It was in the immense, stable thermal battery of the earth itself. The principle is called below-frost line coupling, and it is brutally effective. 6 feet below the surface in northern Minnesota, the ground temperature remains remarkably constant, hovering between 48 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. It is untouched by the polar vortex raging above. It is a vast, free reservoir of low-grade heat. A conventional cabin, sitting on its shallow piers, was completely decoupled from this warmth. Worse, the frozen ground it sat on acted as a heat sink, a thermal vacuum cleaner relentlessly pulling warmth out of the living space. The occupants were essentially camping on a frozen lake. Kārlis's foundation was the opposite. It was a massive, thermally conductive bridge connecting the stable warmth of the deep earth directly to the floor of his home. The 8-foot foundation plunged a full 2 feet below the frost line into that zone of permanent 50-degree soil. The stone, with its high thermal mass and conductivity, absorbed this geothermal heat. Think of it like a copper wire conducting electricity. The foundation was a thermal wire. The deep earth was the power source. The cabin floor was the light bulb. This 50-degree temperature slowly and constantly wicked its way up the entire 8-foot height of the 3-foot-thick stone wall. It was a slow, gentle, unstoppable migration of heat. Because the floor joists were embedded in the stone and the capstones lapped over them, the floorboards were in direct thermal contact with the top of this now warmed foundation. The result? Even when the outside air temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero, the massive stone foundation, constantly recharged by the earth, would not drop below 45 degrees. The floor of the cabin, therefore, could not get colder than 45 degrees. It created a baseline temperature inside the cabin that was nearly 90 degrees warmer than the outside air before a single piece of firewood was even lit. His small wood stove wouldn't be fighting a 90-degree temperature differential. It would only have to raise a 45-degree room to a comfortable 65 degrees. He wouldn't be heating a cabin from scratch every morning. He would be topping up a space that was already, fundamentally, warm. This was the secret buried in his trench. He wasn't building a wall against the cold. He was building a tap into the planet's own warmth. That winter, a polar outbreak of historic severity settled over the Great Lakes. For 14 consecutive nights, the temperature at the Duluth signal station did not rise above 38 degrees below zero. Under a vast, clear Arctic high, the world fell silent and crystalline. The moisture in the air froze directly onto every surface, and by the end of the first week, a feathery, 3-inch thick layer of hoarfrost coated every fence line, every tree branch, every nailhead. It was a cold that found every crack, tested every seam, and broke anything brittle. At the Miller homestead, the family of 5 lived entirely in their 12 by 12-foot kitchen. They hung blankets over the doorways to the other rooms, surrendering them to the deep freeze. Jedediah was burning through his carefully stacked woodpile at a terrifying rate, the stove glowing a dull red around the clock. Still, ice a half-inch thick crept across the inside of their window panes. His wife Mary kept a pot of water simmering constantly, just to put some moisture into the painfully dry, cold air. At the Croft cabin, things were worse. Their only cow, which they'd kept in a lean-to against the main cabin for warmth, had frozen to death standing up. Silas spent his days felling and bucking green wood, a desperate, exhausting labor that produced smoky, inefficient fires. They had run out of potatoes 2 weeks prior and were living on salted fish and cornmeal. Their children were pale and coughed constantly, huddled together under a pile of every blanket and coat they owned. At the Ozoliņš cabin, life was normal. The cold outside was a distant, abstract fact, not an invading enemy. Inside, the air was still and mild. There were no drafts whistling through the chinking, because the foundation did not heave. The floor was the most remarkable part. It was not warm like a heated stone, but it was entirely devoid of cold. It was a neutral, gentle surface. Allegra and Janice could sit on the floor for hours, mending a fishing net their father had woven, their fingers nimble and sure. They wore wool sweaters, but not their heavy coats. The ultimate proof of the cabin's impossible stability sat on a low shelf near the floor. It was a simple clay crock containing rugushbiens, a Latvian cultured milk, similar to yogurt. Ilse had brought the starter culture with her from the old country. For the culture to live, it needed to be kept in a cool, stable environment, never freezing, never getting too warm. In any other cabin in St. Louis County, a crock of milk kept on a floor-level shelf would have frozen solid and split its glaze by Christmas. But here, in the gentle 45-degree air just above the floor, the culture thrived. Ilse could skim the cream off the top each morning. It was a small, quiet, domestic miracle. They were not just surviving the winter, they were living through it, calmly and comfortably, while the world outside froze solid. In the second week of the polar outbreak, Gilbert Thornburg was making his winter circuit, collecting delinquent taxes and serving notices. His sleigh, pulled by a stout Morgan horse, was his office and his refuge. But the brutal cold was taking its toll on his equipment. The iron was contracting. The wood was becoming as brittle as glass. As he navigated a treacherous, frozen track 5 miles west of the Ozoliņš claim, he heard a sharp crack. The sleigh lurched violently, and the right runner splintered, digging into the snow and bringing him to an abrupt, jarring halt. He was stranded. The sun was low, the sky a pale, merciless yellow. His horse stood shivering, its breath pluming in the frigid air. Thornburg knew he was in serious trouble. He was too far to walk back to town, and he would freeze to death if he stayed put. The only shelter nearby was the home of the foolish Latvian. Swallowing his pride, cursing his luck, he unhitched his horse and began the slow, painful walk, leading the animal through the deepening snow. When he reached the Ozoliņš cabin, he could barely form words, his beard a solid mass of ice. Kārlis opened the door and saw the assessor's state. Without a word, he ushered him inside and took his horse to the small, sturdy barn. Thornburg stumbled into the cabin, expecting the familiar shock of a frontier interior. A single bubble of oppressive heat around a glowing stove, surrounded by a universe of bitter cold, especially from the floor. But the air that met him was different. It was uniformly, calmly mild. There was no radiant blast from the stove, which was burning with a low, steady fire. He stomped his feet to knock the snow off, his boots thudding on the floorboards. He expected the familiar, bone-deep cold to shoot up his legs. It didn't. He moved toward the fire, his mind struggling to process the sensory data. Kārlis came back inside and gestured for him to sit. Thornburg sank onto a small wooden bench, his body aching with cold. He needed to whittle a splint for his sleigh runner if he had any hope of making it home. He pulled his stiff, frozen gloves off, fumbling with the knife in his pocket. He began to work on a piece of birch Kārlis handed him. But his boots were stiff and his feet were numb. It was standard practice on the frontier to keep your boots on indoors all winter. To take them off was to invite frostbite from the frozen floor. But something about the persistent, gentle warmth in the room made him reconsider. His back, facing away from the stove, was not cold. His legs were not cold. Slowly, hesitantly, he bent down and worked at the frozen laces of one boot, finally pulling it off. He set his stockinged foot down on the pine floorboards. He froze. He was expecting a dagger of ice. He was expecting the painful shock of 40 below cold, leaching the life from his foot. What he felt instead was a gentle, almost imperceptible coolness, a temperature you might feel on a basement floor in springtime. It was not warm. It was simply not cold. He stared at the floor, then at Kārlis, who was quietly watching him. He pulled his other boot off. He stood up and walked, in his wool socks, across the middle of the floor. His face, which had been a mask of grim survival, slowly slackened with utter disbelief. He had spent his entire life in the North, had assessed hundreds of cabins. He had never felt anything like it. He sat back down, the birch splint forgotten in his hand. He looked at the solid, well-chinked log walls, the small, efficient stove, and then back at the floor. He finally understood the magic wasn't in the walls. It was under his feet. It was the foundation. The whole house was a radiator, gently warmed by the very planet it was built on. He looked at Kārlis, at his calm, knowing eyes. All the mockery, all the confident pronouncements of foolishness died in his throat. He saw not a madman, but a genius. "You didn't build a foundation," Thornburg said, his voice raspy with awe. The line was a perfect crystallization of the truth. "You built a root." When spring finally broke the iron grip of winter, one of Gilbert Thornburg's first official acts was to ride out to the Ozoliņš claim. He did not say much. He handed Kārlis a new tax assessment. It was for a standard residential homestead. The commercial grade notice had been torn up and used to light the fire in the county office stove. Word of Thornburg's conversion spread faster than the story of the warm floor. The assessor, a man known for his rigid adherence to rules, had bent them. Something extraordinary must have happened. Men who had laughed at Kārlis's pit now stopped by on errands, asking to see his woodpile, noting how small it was for a family that had wintered so comfortably. The real spread of the idea, however, happened within his own community. Kārlis was a member of the Latviešu draugu biedrība, the Latvian Friendship Society, a small but tight-knit group of immigrants who met in a Duluth church basement. They shared news from home, helped new arrivals, and pooled their knowledge for the common good. That April, Kārlis was asked to speak. With Ilza translating his quiet, technical Latvian, he explained the principle of the deep foundation. He didn't speak of philosophy or genius. He spoke of the frost line, of the Earth's steady temperature, of thermal mass. He used the charcoal and shingle again, drawing the cross-section of his foundation for all to see. The Latvians, who came from a similar northern climate, understood immediately. This wasn't some strange new magic. It was old-world knowledge, reapplied with precision to a new land. In the May 1893 bulletin of the biedrība, the centerpiece was a detailed hand-drawn diagram of the Ozoliņš pamati, the Ozoliņš foundation. It showed the dimensions, the depth below the frost line, and the crucial detail of the joists embedded in the stone. That summer, 9 other Latvian farmsteads across St. Louis County began digging. The sound of shovels in the cutover was no longer a sign of one man's supposed madness, but of a community's shared wisdom. By the following winter, these 9 families were reporting fuel savings of over 70%. More importantly, they reported a winter of unprecedented health and comfort. The Ozoliņš Foundation became a standard for the Latvian settlers, a piece of their homeland remade in Minnesota stone. What Kārlis Ozoliņš accomplished on that windswept bluff in 1892 was more than just a warm cabin. He was practicing a form of building science that was nearly a century ahead of its time. Modern architects and engineers would recognize his techniques immediately. His use of the Earth's stable temperature is the basis for modern geothermal heating and cooling systems. His massive, insulated foundation is a direct ancestor of the frost-protected shallow foundations and passive house designs that are now at the cutting edge of energy-efficient construction. He understood the critical importance of thermal mass, the ability of a dense material like stone to absorb, store, and slowly release heat. He understood ground coupling, the deliberate use of the earth as a thermal partner rather than an adversary. He achieved with stone, lime, and intuition what we now achieve with foam insulation, vapor barriers, and complex heat exchangers. He had no scientific instruments, no BTUs or R values to guide him. He had only a deep, generational understanding of how a structure should relate to the ground it stands on. His work was a quiet rebuke to the prevailing frontier ethos, a demonstration that the most elegant solutions are often the simplest, and the most powerful forces are the ones we can choose to work with rather than against. The lesson of the Ozoliņš Foundation is a profound one. The American frontier spirit was often one of conflict, man against the wilderness, man against the winter. The goal was to conquer, to tame, to build a fortress that could withstand the onslaught of a hostile environment. The log cabin, sitting high on its piers, was the very symbol of this mindset, a wooden box bravely holding its own against the cold, separate and defiant. Kārlis Ozoliņš worked from a different philosophy, one born of an older, colder land. His design was not about defiance. It was about connection. It was not a fortress. It was an agreement. He saw the winter not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a condition to be understood. He knew that just below the chaos and the killing cold of the surface, the earth offered a steady, quiet, and inexhaustible warmth. His genius was not in building a better wall to keep the cold out, but in building a better bridge to let the warmth in. He didn't build against winter. He taught his foundation to hold hands with the earth below. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet ingenuity. If you found this glimpse into historical building science as fascinating as we do, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It helps our channel bring more of these forgotten histories to light. And we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What modern technologies do you think owe a debt to simple, old-world wisdom like this? We appreciate your time and your curiosity. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes only. It presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by real historical building practices and principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative reconstruction. While the technical principles discussed are based on established science, basic installations any application of historical techniques in a modern context should be done in consultation with qualified professionals and in accordance with current building codes, safety standards, and local regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.